This is the story of one of World War II's most persistent legends, and what really happened when we examine the historical record. You've probably seen the viral story about American artillerymen with M7 Priest howitzers who used a forbidden direct-fire tactic to ambush and destroy an entire German Panzer column near St. Vith during the Battle of the Bulge. The narrative is compelling, American ingenuity triumphing over German armor. There's just one problem, and that's what the documented evidence actually tells a very different story. What we're going to do today is examine what actually happened at St. Vith in December 1944, who the real heroes were, and why the truth turns out to be more interesting than the legend. We'll look at primary sources, official Army histories, and unit records to understand both what these American artillerymen accomplished and what they didn't. The defense of St. Vith was genuinely heroic and critically important to stopping Hitler's last gamble in the West, but it didn't happen the way the viral story claims. The legend. Let me start by laying out the legend as it's commonly told, because chances are you've encountered some version of this story online or in popular histories. The narrative goes like this. During the Battle of the Bulge, elite German Panzer divisions with veteran crews, fresh from brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, smashed through American lines and advanced toward the key Belgian town of St. Vith. These arrogant German tankers expected an easy victory against what they considered soft American troops, but what they encountered instead was a ghost in the forest. A small, forgotten American artillery unit called the 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, armed with M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, decided to break every rule in the book. These M7 Priests mounted 105mm howitzers designed exclusively for long-range indirect fire support, and using them against tanks in direct fire was considered suicidal and forbidden by doctrine. But according to the legend, these innovative American gunners positioned their invisible guns deep in the snow-covered woods near St. Vith. Using brilliant shoot-and-scoot tactics, they systematically ambushed and destroyed an entire German Panzer column, and the shocked German tank crews found themselves hunted by a phantom enemy they couldn't see, firing a weapon that shouldn't have been there in a way it was never designed for. American ingenuity turning a forbidden idea into one of the most stunning tactical victories of the battle. The story has everything you want in a World War II narrative: the underdog Americans, the innovative tactics, the shocked Germans, the total destruction of an enemy column. Now let me show you what the primary sources actually say. The Battle of St. Vith, December 1944. To understand what really happened, we need to understand the Battle of St. Vith itself, because this was one of the most critical engagements of the entire Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944. Hitler launched his last major offensive in the West, Operation Wacht am Rhein, what we know as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious: punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, race to the Belgian port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and force a negotiated peace in the West before turning all German resources back to fight the Soviets. Speed was everything in the German plan. Their timetable called for seizing the town of St. Vith by 6 p.m. on December 17th, just one day into the offensive, and this wasn't an arbitrary objective. St. Vith sat at the junction of 6 paved roads and 3 rail lines, which meant without controlling St. Vith, German supply columns would be practically immobilized in the rugged, forested Ardennes terrain. Every hour of delay meant fewer supplies reaching the spearhead units and less chance of reaching Antwerp before Allied reinforcements arrived. The initial German assault hit the green, inexperienced 106th Infantry Division. 2 entire regiments of the 106th, the 422nd, and 423rd were surrounded and forced to surrender on December 19th in one of the largest American capitulations in the European theater. Over 8,000 men became prisoners. But not everyone broke. Remnants of the 106th, along with elements of the 7th Armored Division and 9th Armored Division, formed a desperate defensive perimeter around St. Vith, and among these defenders was the 225th Armored Field Artillery Battalion with their 18 M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers. The battle raged from December 17th through December 23rd. The Americans finally withdrew in an organized retrograde operation, but they held St. Vith for 6 critical days. The German timetable called for capturing the town by the evening of December 17th, but they didn't take it until December 21st, and American forces continued fighting, delaying actions until the 23rd. That 6-day delay had strategic consequences. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the German 5th Panzer Army, later recommended to Hitler that the entire offensive be abandoned on December 24th. And the St. Vith bottleneck was one of the key reasons why. The defense of St. Vith was critically important, no question about that. American forces there genuinely helped derail Hitler's last gamble. But who were these defenders, and what did they actually do? The real units at St. Vith. Let's start with the American side, because getting the units right matters when you're trying to understand what happened. The 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion was indeed present at St. Vith, a self-propelled artillery battalion equipped with 18 M7 Priest howitzers. The battalion was initially attached to the 14th Cavalry Group and later provided fire support for Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division. For their actions at St. Vith from December 17th through 23rd, the 275th received a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit awards the U.S. military can bestow. They also received the citation in the Order of the Day of the Belgian Army and the Belgian Fourragère, which tells you their contribution was recognized at the highest levels. Other American artillery units in the sector included the 434th Armored Field Artillery Battalion and the 489th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, both organic to the 7th Armored Division. Lieutenant Colonel James G. Dubuisson commanded the 434th. But here's what matters. The Americans also had dedicated anti-tank forces at St. Vith. The 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion was present with 90mm guns. The 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron provided armored car support. The 7th Armored Division had its own tank battalions, and the anti-aircraft artillery units had 50 caliber quad-mount machine guns, what soldiers called the meat chopper, devastating against soft-skinned vehicles and infantry. Now let's look at the German side, because this is where the legend starts to unravel. German forces attacking St. Vith belonged to General der Artillerie Walter Lücht's LXBI Corps, part of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army. The primary attacking formations were the 18th Volksgrenadier Division and the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division. Here's the critical point. These were not elite panzer divisions and most definitely not veteran crews from the Eastern Front. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division was formed in Denmark in September 1944, just 3 months before the Battle of the Bulge. The division was cobbled together from Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine personnel, Air Force, and Navy troops who had minimal ground combat training. General Major Günther Hoffmann Schönborn commanded the division, and he had no previous combat command experience. The 62nd Volksgrenadier Division was even worse. The unit had been reconstituted with Czech and Polish conscripts, many of whom couldn't speak German. These were not the hardened Eastern Front veterans of legend, but poorly trained replacement troops thrown into a desperate offensive. Now there was one genuinely elite unit that participated in the final assault on St. Vith, the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with Tiger II tanks. This unit was an Eastern Front veteran formation. 6 Tiger IIs from this battalion broke the final American resistance on Prumberg Hill on December 21st, using star shells to blind the defenders before systematically destroying American vehicles with armor-piercing rounds at ranges where the Americans couldn't effectively fight back. There were some Tigers involved, yes. But the narrative that the entire German force consisted of elite Eastern Front Panzer veterans? The historical record doesn't support that. Most of the attacking troops were green Volksgrenadier infantry with limited armor support. What the documents actually say. Now we get to the heart of the matter, what the primary sources tell us about the 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion and their M7 priests. The U.S. Army Armor School conducted a detailed analysis of the Battle of St. Vith, and their official document provides information you need to understand. Here's what it says about the 275th. They had shifted their batteries so as to form roadblocks and had sighted their guns for direct fire. The 275th did position their guns for direct fire capability, documented fact. Artillery crews prepared defensive positions that would allow them to engage targets directly if necessary, standard defensive practice when artillery units were in danger of being overrun. But here's where things get interesting. That same Army Armor School document describes the famous German column destruction incident, and it tells a very different story than the legend. According to the official analysis, a German column got lost on the road between Ober-Emmels and Nieder, Emmels, and stopped bumper to bumper, a perfect target for a concentration. When artillery was called for, the ammunition shortage had to be considered, and finally it was decided that this target merited the firing of the remaining white phosphorus. The German column was burned and destroyed. Read that carefully. A German column was indeed destroyed, but it was destroyed by indirect fire, conventional artillery fire, from positions behind American lines using white phosphorus shells. White phosphorus creates intense heat and smoke, devastating against troops and vehicles in the open. The column was burned and destroyed by artillery, doing exactly what artillery is supposed to do, providing indirect fire support. This was not a direct fire ambush. This was artillerymen exploiting a target of opportunity with a conventional fire mission. The Germans got lost, bunched up bumper to bumper on a narrow road, and became a perfect target for concentrated artillery fire. The Americans, despite being critically short on ammunition with rations of just 7 rounds per gun, decided this target was worth expending their remaining white phosphorus. We have a confirmed German column destruction. We have confirmed M7 priests positioned for direct fire capability. But the documents don't say the M7 priests engaged German tanks in direct fire. Those are two separate events being conflated in the legend. Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history, The Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, provides additional detail about close combat near St. Vith. German forces attacked near Hinderhausen on December 21st, and Cole's history states the 275th beat off the attack with help from 2 tanks and an anti-aircraft artillery half-track mounting the dreaded 50 caliber quad. Notice what's missing from that account. No mention of M7 priests firing directly at German armor. The close-range defensive fire came from tanks, which is what tanks are for, and anti-aircraft artillery, famously effective, against ground targets. The forbidden tactic Myth. One of the most persistent elements of the legend claims that using M7 priests in direct fire against tanks was forbidden or against doctrine, that these innovative American gunners were breaking the rules to achieve victory. This is false. Field Manual 17-60, Armored Division Artillery, published in August 1942, explicitly addressed this situation. The manual stated that armored artillery would fight hostile tanks when necessary and would provide defensive fires. Using self-propelled artillery in direct fire was not forbidden, just not the preferred role. Let me explain why. The M7 Priest was built on a modified M3 Lee tank chassis and mounted a 105mm M2A1 howitzer in an open-topped fighting compartment. Armor ranged from 12.7mm to 38mm, enough to protect against small arms and shell fragments, but not enough to survive direct hits from tank guns. The 105mm howitzer had limited traverse, 35 degrees right and 15 degrees left. To engage targets outside that arc, you had to reposition the entire 25-ton vehicle. The howitzer was designed for high-angle indirect fire, giving it a low muzzle velocity of about 1,250 feet per second for anti-tank rounds, and low velocity meant reduced accuracy at range, with a curved trajectory that made direct fire more challenging. Each M7 carried 69 rounds of ammunition and was crewed by 7 men. Crews were equipped with submachine guns and a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the vehicle, which tells you planners definitely expected these vehicles might need to defend themselves. The U.S. Army did issue heat ammunition, high-explosive anti-tank, for the 105mm howitzer. The M67 heat round could penetrate approximately 140 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor, enough to defeat a Panzer IV from any angle, penetrate a Panther at favorable angles, and even threaten a Tiger flank. The frontal armor of a Tiger II at 150 millimeters would be immune, but the sides and rear at 80 millimeters would be vulnerable. An M7 Priest could technically kill German tanks if it could get into position and land a hit. But doing so would require closing to 500 to 1,000 meters for reliable hits, given the howitzer's trajectory, and at those ranges you're well within effective range of German tank guns, while your thin armor and open top make you extremely vulnerable. This is why doctrine designated tank destroyers for anti-tank work. Tank destroyers had better guns, better gun-laying equipment for direct fire, and at least in theory, better armor. The M7 Priest could fight tanks if necessary, the manual said so explicitly. But it wasn't the preferred tool for the job. Using M7s in direct fire wasn't forbidden. The tactic was recognized as a desperation measure, not a primary tactic. There's also this claimed shoot-and-scoot tactic mentioned in the legend, but the term is anachronistic. Shoot and scoot became common terminology in the 1960s with the development of self-propelled nuclear artillery. The concept was to fire a nuclear round and immediately relocate before enemy counter-battery fire, or fallout, affected the crew. While the idea of firing and moving existed in World War II, this specific terminology didn't. The real anti-tank heroes. If the M7 Priests weren't conducting these dramatic direct-fire ambushes against German armor, who was? The answer is tank destroyer crews. Hugh Cole's official Army history documents multiple instances of American tank destroyers engaging German armor in direct fire at St. Vith, and these accounts have the kind of specific detail that's missing from the M7 Priest story. Here's one example. American 90mm tank destroyers from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion, waiting on the reverse slope, caught the first wave of 4 Panthers in their sights, fired 7 rounds, and knocked out all 4. 4 Panthers destroyed with 7 rounds. Germany's excellent Panther. Medium tank? Gone. That's the kind of precise, deadly gunnery you get from crews trained specifically for anti-tank work using weapons designed for that purpose. Another documented engagement had a tank destroyer section knock out a Panther and 1 assault gun with 3 rounds. These tank destroyer crews weren't hiding in ambush as a desperate gamble. They were doing exactly what they were trained to do, using hull-down positions, excellent optics, powerful 90mm guns, and skilled gunnery to defeat German armor at ranges where the Germans couldn't effectively return fire. There's also a famous incident involving an M8 armored car from the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. An M8 was a light-wheeled reconnaissance vehicle armed only with a 37mm gun, completely inadequate for fighting German heavy tanks. But one M8 crew faced with a Tiger tank made an incredibly brave decision. They closed to 25 yards, almost point-blank range, and fired 3 37mm rounds into the Tiger's thin rear armor. The Tiger was destroyed. That's the kind of specific documented action that makes for great history. We know the unit, we know the vehicle type, we know the range, we know how many rounds were fired, we know the result. Compare that to the M7 Priest ambush legend. Despite extensive primary source material on the Battle of St. Vith, including official histories, unit records, and after-action reports, I cannot find a single documented instance of an M7 Priest crew engaging and destroying a German tank in direct fire during this battle. The 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion absolutely contributed to the defense. They fired thousands of rounds of indirect fire. They positioned for direct fire as a defensive precaution, and they earned their Presidential Unit citation. But the documented evidence for them ambushing and destroying German Panzers in direct fire? It's not there. Separating the verified from the embellished. Let me lay this out systematically because I want to be clear about what we can verify versus what appears to be embellishment or conflation of different events. Verified and documented. The 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion was at St. Vith. True. Verified and documented. They positioned their guns for direct fire capability. True, explicitly stated in the Army Armor School analysis. Verified and documented. A German column was destroyed. True, confirmed in primary sources. But here's where verification stops. The sources say that column was destroyed by indirect fire using white phosphorus shells, not direct fire. The German column got lost, bunched up, and became a target for conventional artillery fire. Verified and documented. Tank destroyer crews engaged and destroyed German tanks in direct fire at St. Vith. Multiple specific instances confirmed in Cole's official history. Not documented in primary sources. M7 Priests firing directly at German tanks. Primary sources are silent on this. Not supported by evidence. Germans being shocked by artillery in direct fire role. No German sources confirm this, and given that German forces routinely used their 88mm flak guns in direct fire against Allied armor as one of their most feared weapons, the idea that they'd be shocked by Americans doing something similar is questionable. Definitively false. The claim that direct fire was forbidden. Field Manual 17-60 explicitly provided for this, and heat ammunition was issued for exactly this purpose. Mostly false. The claim that attacking forces were elite Eastern Front veterans. The 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier Divisions were newly formed units with limited combat experience, though the 506th Heavy Panzer Battalion with Tiger IIs was genuinely an elite unit. Absolutely true, St. Vith was a key objective. The town controlled 6 roads and 3 rail lines, absolutely critical for the German advance. Absolutely true. The defense of St. Vith was strategically important. The WWII 6-day delay disrupted the entire German offensive timeline, and Manteuffel recommended abandoning the offensive partly because of this bottleneck. Anachronistic, the shoot and scoot terminology. This phrase originated in the 1960s, though the concept of firing and relocating existed in World War II. The strategic importance. While the direct fire ambush narrative doesn't hold up to scrutiny, the actual strategic importance of what happened at St. Vith cannot be overstated. The German operational plan required capturing St. Vith by 6 p.m. on December 17th, one day into the offensive. They needed those roads and rail lines to funnel supplies forward to their spearhead units racing toward the Meuse River and Antwerp. Without St. Vith, their logistics would collapse. The Americans held until December 21st before being forced to withdraw, a delay of 4 days beyond the German timetable. But even after St. Vith fell, American forces continued fighting delaying actions, until December 23rd, extending the delay to 6 days. What did those 6 days cost the Germans? First, the delay forced German units to bunch up behind the St. Vith bottleneck, creating massive traffic jams. Armor, infantry, and supplies all backed up on narrow roads in the Ardennes, and this congestion made them vulnerable to Allied air attacks once the weather cleared. Second, it gave the Americans time to rush reinforcements to the threatened sector. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions reached Bastogne and other critical points. The 2nd Armored Division moved into blocking positions, and British XXX Corps deployed as a strategic reserve. Every hour the Germans lost at St. Vith was an hour for the Allies to reinforce. Third, it consumed German fuel and ammunition. The German plan counted on capturing American fuel stocks because they started the offensive with barely enough fuel to reach the Meuse River. 6 days of continuous combat around St. Vith with nothing to show. For it, but a smoking ruin drained resources they couldn't replace. By December 24th, General Manteuffel was recommending to Hitler that they abandon the offensive. The leading German elements were still over 30 miles from the Meuse, nowhere near Antwerp, and facing strengthening Allied resistance. The St. Vith bottleneck was one of the key factors in this failure. For their role in this defense, the 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation. The 434th Armored Field Artillery Battalion received the same honor, and Belgium awarded both battalions the citation in the Order of the Day of the Belgian Army and the Belgian Fourragère. These were not cheap honors. They were earned through 6 days of desperate fighting under appalling conditions, including freezing weather, ammunition shortages, being surrounded by numerically superior forces, and facing Tiger tanks and veteran German infantry. The artillerymen of these battalions did their jobs under circumstances that would break lesser units. They just didn't do it the way the viral legend claims. Why legends develop? Before I conclude, I want to address why these legends develop, because understanding that helps us appreciate both the real history and the human need to tell heroic stories. Veterans come home with memories of chaotic, terrifying combat. Different units were in different positions, communication was poor, and nobody had a clear picture of the entire battle. An artilleryman might have heard about a German column being destroyed and seen his own unit positioned for direct fire, and in memory, those two separate facts merge into one narrative. Popular histories and magazine articles in the 1950s and 60s wanted dramatic stories to honor veterans. Editors would push for more exciting narratives, and details from different units might get combined. The technical distinction between direct fire and indirect fire seemed like a minor point compared to the drama of the story. The Internet age has amplified these legends. A dramatic story gets shared on social media. YouTube videos with eye-catching titles get millions of views, and each retelling adds a bit more drama. Soon the legend has completely overshadowed the documented history. I'm not accusing anyone of deliberate fabrication. Human memory is fallible, unit histories written by participants aren't always reliable, and the fog of war is real. Veterans themselves often believed versions of events that don't match the archival record. But as historians, and all of us become historians when we try to understand the past, we have a responsibility to distinguish between documented fact and dramatic narrative. The documented facts are impressive enough. American forces at St. Vith, outnumbered and nearly surrounded, held a critical road junction for 6 days against German forces that needed it immediately. Artillery battalions, tank destroyer battalions, tank battalions, infantry, engineers, and cavalry reconnaissance all fought together in a desperate combined arms defense that disrupted Hitler's last gamble in the West. That's worthy of a Presidential Unit Citation. That's worthy of Belgian honors. That's worthy of our respect and remembrance. We don't need to add fictional ambushes or forbidden tactics or shocked enemy veterans to make the story more impressive. The truth is impressive enough. What really happened with the M7 priests at St. Vith? The 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 18 M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, was part of the defensive force at St. Vith from December 17th through 23rd, 1944. They positioned their guns to allow direct fire if necessary, a standard defensive precaution when artillery units face potential overrun. A German column was destroyed near their positions, but primary sources document this destruction came from indirect fire using white phosphorus shells, not a direct fire ambush. The dramatic direct-fire anti-tank kills at St. Vith were achieved by tank destroyer crews from the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion and others, doing exactly what they were trained to do with weapons designed for that purpose. An armored car crew from the 87th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron famously destroyed a Tiger tank at point-blank range. The M7 Priest was technically capable of engaging German armor with heat ammunition, and doctrine explicitly allowed this when necessary. It was never a forbidden tactic, just not the preferred role for a weapon designed for indirect fire support. Whether the 275th's M7 Priests ever actually engaged German tanks in direct fire at St. Vith cannot be confirmed from available primary sources. The defense of St. Vith was genuinely critical to disrupting the German offensive. The 6-day delay helped ensure the failure of Hitler's last gamble, and the units that fought there, including the 275th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, earned their decorations through genuine valor under desperate circumstances. The legend of the M7 Priest ambush appears to conflate several documented events: the positioning of artillery for direct fire, the destruction of a German column by indirect fire, and the anti-tank actions of tank destroyer crews. This conflation, combined with natural embellishment through retelling, has created a dramatic narrative that doesn't match the archival record. Does this diminish what the 275th accomplished? Absolutely not. They were artillerymen who found themselves on the front line of one of the war's most critical battles, and they adapted, they fought, and they held their ground against numerically superior forces. They fired thousands of rounds of supporting fire while rationed to just 7 rounds per gun. They earned a Presidential Unit Citation. That's a legacy to be proud of. As military history enthusiasts, our job is to honor veterans by telling their real stories as accurately as possible. Sometimes that means disappointing people who want the dramatic legend to be true, but in this case, as in so many others, the documented truth turns out to be more interesting than the simplified legend. The Battle of St. Vith was won by combined arms, artillery, tank destroyers, tanks, infantry, and engineers all working together under terrible conditions. The battle was won by logistics officers stretching limited ammunition to maximum effect, and by commanders making difficult decisions about when to hold and when to withdraw. The victory came from soldiers doing their specific jobs competently under circumstances that would have broken less well-trained forces. That's the real story of St. Vith. That's the story worth remembering. The M7 Priests were there. They contributed. They earned their citations, but they didn't single-handedly ambush and destroy German Panzer columns in direct fire using forbidden tactics. That's a legend, an understandable legend, even a well-intentioned legend, but a legend nonetheless. The truth, properly understood, is honor enough.